wind tore across the Wyoming plains, a bitter, howling thing that carried flecks of ice and the scent of pine. In the dim glow of a lantern swaying above the deserted train platform, Clara Hensley stood alone, her high-collared coat pulled tight against her throat. Her hands, chapped and trembling, clutched a threadbare satchel, its leather cracked from years of use. Beside her, a small bundle stirred, a scarf-wrapped form, no bigger than a child, pressed against her side. It was her sister, Lily, barely 8, her breath shallow in the cold. Clara's eyes darted along the platform, searching for movement, for any sign of pursuit. There was none, only the wind and the distant cry of a wolf. 2 days earlier, in a drafty barn on the edge of their father's failing homestead, Clara had overheard the deal. Her father, his voice slurred with whiskey, had bartered her to a man with a crooked nose and a wad of cash. "She's strong enough," he'd said, as if discussing livestock. "She'll do for you." Clara, hidden in the loft, had pressed her hand over Lily's mouth to stifle her sobs. The man's shadow loomed large against the barn wall, and Clara's heart had pounded so fiercely she thought it might betray her. She'd seen the marks on his knuckles, the kind that left scars. She knew what awaited her if she stayed. That night, under a moonless sky, Clara had taken Lily's hand and fled. They'd walked for hours, barefoot at first, until Clara found a pair of worn boots in an abandoned shack. The boots were too big, rubbing blisters into her heels, but they kept the frostbite at bay. They'd stolen a loaf of bread from a windowsill in the next town, and Clara had whispered apologies to the stars, promising to repay it someday. Now here they were, on a platform in the middle of nowhere, with no money, no food, and no plan beyond survival. Clara's neck ached beneath her collar, the tender skin marked by bruises that hadn't yet faded. Her father's hands had left them there a week ago, when she dared to refuse the marriage he'd arranged. "You'll do as you're told," he growled, his grip tightening until her vision blurred. She hadn't cried, not then, not now. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford, not with Lily depending on her. But the weight of it all pressed down, heavier than the snow gathering at her feet. The platform creaked under the wind's assault, and Clara's gaze flickered to the horizon. The town of Bitter Creek lay just beyond, a scattering of lights in the distance, promising shelter but also danger. She didn't know who might be waiting there, who might have heard of a runaway girl and her sister. Her father's reach was long, his temper longer. She adjusted the scarf around Lily's face, tucking in a stray lock of hair. The child's eyes, wide and blue, looked up at her with a trust that made Clara's chest ache. "We'll be all right," she whispered, though the words felt like a lie. She didn't notice the man at first. He stood at the far end of the platform, half hidden in the shadows, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the lantern's glow. Elias Turner, the town blacksmith, had been watching her for some time. He'd come to the station to collect a shipment of iron, but the sight of the young woman and her bundled child had stopped him cold. There was something in the way she stood, fierce yet fragile, like a deer caught in a trap but refusing to break. He saw the way her hand hovered protectively over the child, the way her eyes scanned the darkness as if expecting a predator. Elias knew that look. He'd seen it in his own reflection years ago, after the war had taken his brother and left him with scars of his own. He stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden planks, and Clara's head snapped toward him. Her body tensed, one arm curling around Lily as if to shield her from a blow. Elias stopped, raising his hand slowly, palms open. "I don't mean to startle you," he said, his voice low, tempered by the same calm he used with skittish horses. "You look like you could use some help." Clara's lips parted, but no words came. She studied him, his weathered face, the lines etched by years of hard work, the dark eyes that held no malice. His coat was patched but clean, his hands calloused but steady. She wanted to refuse, to run, but Lily's small frame shivered against her, and the cold was seeping through her own thin coat. "We're fine," she managed, her voice hoarse. But it wasn't true, and they both knew it. Elias nodded, as if her words were enough, though his gaze lingered on the way her collar rode high, hiding something he couldn't quite name. "There's a storm coming," he said, glancing at the sky. My place isn't far. You and the little one can warm up there, if you like. No strings. Clara hesitated, her heart warring with itself. Trust was a dangerous thing, a currency she'd spent too freely in the past. But Lily's fingers were cold in hers, and the platform offered no shelter from the wind. She nodded, barely, and Elias stepped back, giving her space. He didn't smile or press her further, only turned and gestured toward a horse tied to a post nearby. "It's a short ride," he said. "I'll walk." As they moved toward the horse, Clara's eyes caught the glint of a hammer hanging from his belt, its handle worn smooth by years of use. It was a blacksmith's tool, solid and heavy, capable of shaping iron or breaking it. For a moment, fear flickered through her, but then she saw the way he adjusted the blanket on the horse's back, his hands gentle, deliberate. She swallowed, pushing the fear down. She had no choice but to follow. The ride was silent, save for the crunch of snow under the horse's hooves and the occasional whimper from Lily, who clung to Clara's waist. Elias led the way, his lantern casting a faint glow on the path. Clara watched his back, broad and steady, and wondered what kind of man offered shelter to strangers in a storm. She didn't know if she could trust him, but for now, it was enough that he hadn't asked questions. The wind howled behind them, as if urging them forward, and Clara tightened her grip on Lily. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to hope. Not much, just a flicker, like the lantern swinging in Elias's hand. The snow fell thicker now, swirling around Clara and Lily as they followed Elias Turner through the Wyoming night. The horse's hooves sank into the deepening drifts, and Clara held her sister close, the child's small body trembling against her own. Elias walked ahead, his lantern casting a faint halo of light, his broad frame cutting a path through the storm. He hadn't spoken since they left the platform, and Clara was grateful for the silence. Words felt dangerous, like they might reveal too much of the fear coiled tight in her chest. She kept her eyes on his back, watching the way his coat strained across his shoulders with each steady step. The hammer at his belt swayed gently, a reminder of his strength and her vulnerability. The path wound through a copse of pines, their branches heavy with snow, until a low cabin came into view. It sat at the edge of Bitter Creek, its chimney puffing faint smoke into the sky. The windows glowed softly, promising warmth, and Clara felt a pang of longing so sharp it startled her. She hadn't known a home in years, not since her mother died, leaving her and Lily to their father's neglect. The cabin looked modest but solid, its log walls weathered yet sturdy, like the man who led them to it. Elias stopped at the hitching post, tying the horse with practiced ease. "It's not much," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic, "but it's warm and there's food." He turned to Clara, his dark eyes meeting hers for the first time since the platform. "You don't have to stay long, just until the storm passes." Clara nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to refuse, to keep moving, but Lily's weight against her was a reminder of how little strength they had left. The child's lips were pale, her fingers icy despite the scarf wrapped around them. "Thank you," Clara managed, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. She wasn't used to kindness, not without a price. Elias led them to the door, pushing it open to reveal a single room lit by the soft glow of a fire. The air smelled of wood smoke and something savory, stew, perhaps, simmering on the hearth. A worn table stood in the center, flanked by 2 chairs, and a narrow bed was tucked against one wall, its quilt neatly folded. Everything was simple, functional, but there was a care in the details. The floor swept clean, the firewood stacked neatly by the hearth, a single shelf holding a few books, and a tin cup polished to a shine. It was the home of a man who lived alone, yet it felt like a sanctuary. "Sit," Elias said, gesturing to the table. He moved to the hearth, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. "It's just rabbit and potatoes, but it's hot." He didn't look at her as he spoke, and Clara sensed he was giving her space, letting her decide how much to trust. She eased Lily onto a chair, unwrapping the scarf to reveal the child's pale face, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Clara's own stomach growled, but she ignored it, focusing on her sister. She brushed a strand of hair from Lily's forehead, whispering, You're safe now." Lily's gaze flicked to Elias, uncertain, and Clara followed her look. He was ladling stew into bowls, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He set one bowl in front of Lily, then another for Clara, before stepping back to lean against the wall. "Eat what you can," he said. "I'll see to the horse." And with that, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Clara stared at the steaming bowl, her hands trembling as she picked up the spoon. The warmth of the cabin was seeping into her bones, loosening the fear that had held her rigid for days. She fed Lily first, watching the child take small, hesitant bites, her eyes growing brighter with each spoonful. Only then did Clara allow herself a taste. The stew was simple, but it was the first hot food she'd had in days, and it brought an ache to her throat that had nothing to do with hunger. When Elias returned, his coat dusted with snow, Clara tensed again. He didn't approach the table, only hung his coat on a peg and moved to the fire, adding a log. "Storm's getting worse," he said, his back to her. "You're welcome to the bed. I'll take the floor." He paused, then added, "There's a spare blanket in the chest if you need it." Clara's fingers tightened around the spoon. She wanted to ask why he was doing this, what he wanted in return, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she said, "We won't stay long." Her voice was sharper than she intended, a defense against the softness of the moment. Elias nodded, still facing the fire. "Stay as long as you need. No one's coming through that door unless you say so." His words were steady, like a promise carved in stone, and Clara felt something shift inside her, a crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. Lily finished her stew, her head drooping against Clara's arm. Clara lifted her gently, carrying her to the bed and tucking the quilt around her. The child's breathing deepened, her small chest rising and falling in the rhythm of sleep. Clara stood there for a long moment, watching her sister, memorizing the peace on her face. It was a luxury she hadn't dared hope for. When she turned, Elias was still by the fire, his hands clasped behind his back. He hadn't asked her name, hadn't pried into her story, and yet his silence felt like a question. She adjusted her collar, ensuring the bruises remained hidden, and sat back at the table. "You live alone," she said, not quite a question. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Have for a while. Suits me." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence. Finally, he said, "You don't have to tell me anything, but if someone's looking for you, I'd rather know." Clara's heart stuttered. She thought of her father, his heavy hands, the man with the crooked nose who'd paid for her. "No one's looking," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias's eyes lingered on her, and for a moment, she feared he could see through her, through the collar, through the bravado, to the scars beneath. But he only nodded, turning back to the fire. She watched him, this stranger who'd offered her shelter without demanding answers. His hands, rough from years at the forge, moved with a quiet grace as he banked the fire for the night. There was a loneliness in him, she thought, as deep as her own. And yet, he'd open his door to her, to Lily, without hesitation. It was a kindness she didn't understand, but for now was enough. She settled onto the bed beside Lily, the quilt warm against her skin, and let her eyes drift closed. For the first time in days, sleep came without fear. Clara woke to the scent of coffee and the faint, rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood. The cabin was warm, the fire and the hearth reduced to glowing embers, casting a soft light across the room. She lay still for a moment, her arm curled around Lily, who slept soundly beneath the quilt, her small face peaceful in a way Clara hadn't seen in months. The unfamiliarity of safety pressed against her chest, heavy and disorienting. She wasn't used to stillness, to waking without the instinct to run. She sat up slowly, her eyes tracing the room in the morning light. It was as simple as it had seemed last night, but the daylight revealed more. A pair of boots polished and lined up by the door, a shelf with a few well-worn books, a Bible, a volume of poetry, a farmer's almanac. The table held a tin mug and a plate with crumbs, evidence that Elias had already eaten. Everything was orderly, cared for, yet there was a quiet emptiness to it, as if the cabin had been waiting for someone to fill it. Through the window, she saw him, Elias, his sleeves rolled up despite the cold, splitting logs with steady, practiced swings. His breath clouded in the air, and the axe gleamed as it caught the weak sunlight. Clara's fingers brushed her collar, ensuring it covered the bruises on her neck, and she stood, careful not to wake Lily. She moved to the hearth, where a pot of coffee simmered, and poured a cup, the warmth of the mug seeping into her hands. It was a small act, pouring coffee, but it felt like a claim to the moment, a tether to this strange, safe place. The door creaked open, and Elias stepped inside, his arms laden with firewood. He paused when he saw her, his dark eyes flicking to the mug in her hands. "Morning," he said, his voice low, as if mindful of the sleeping child. "Hope you slept all right." Clara nodded, her throat tight. "Better than we have in a while." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she regretted their honesty. She didn't want to owe him explanations, didn't want to owe him anything. But Elias only nodded, stacking the wood by the hearth with the same care he seemed to give everything. "There's bread and jam on the table," he said, brushing sawdust from his hands. "Eat what you can. I'm heading out to check the fence line. If you want to leave, the trail to town's clear enough. If not—" He hesitated, his gaze steady but not pressing. "There's a spare room through that door. It's small, but it's yours if you need it." Clara followed his gesture to a narrow door she hadn't noticed last night. The offer hung between them, simple yet profound, and she felt the weight of her own indecision. Leaving meant facing the cold, the uncertainty, the possibility of her father's men finding them. Staying meant trusting a stranger, a man whose kindness she couldn't yet understand. She glanced at Lily, still asleep, and the choice settled over her like a blanket. "We'll stay," she said quietly. "For now." Elias gave a single nod, as if her decision was neither surprising nor burdensome. "I'll be back by noon," he said, pulling on his coat. "There's water in the bucket, and the outhouse is behind the cabin." He paused at the door, his hand on the latch. "No one comes here without my say. You're safe." And then he was gone, his boots crunching through the snow. Clara stood for a long moment, the mug cooling in her hands. She moved to the window, watching him disappear into the pines, his figure strong and solitary against the white landscape. There was something in the way he carried himself, steady, unyielding, yet marked by a quiet sorrow. She wondered what had made him this way, what losses had carved the lines into his face. Lily stirred, her small voice breaking the silence. "Clara," she murmured, sitting up, her eyes wide as she took in the cabin. "Where are we?" "With a friend," Clara said, the word feeling strange but not entirely wrong. She crossed to the bed, smoothing Lily's hair. "Come on, let's get you some breakfast." She helped Lily to the table, slicing bread and spreading it with jam from a jar Elias had left out. The child ate eagerly, her color returning with each bite, and Clara felt a flicker of relief. She glanced around the cabin again, noticing small signs of care. A pair of clean socks folded on the shelf, a scarf draped over a chair, as if Elias had anticipated their needs. She found herself moving, almost without thinking, to the bucket by the hearth. She washed the dishes from breakfast, the act grounding her, giving her hands something to do while her mind wrestled with what came next. When Lily finished eating, Clara opened the door to the spare room. It was small, barely more than a closet, with a narrow cot and a single window, but it was clean, the linens fresh, and a faint scent of cedar lingered in the air. Clara set their satchel inside, a small gesture of commitment to staying, at least for now. She returned to the main room, her eyes catching on the axe leaning against the wall. It was heavy, well used, but its blade was sharp, cared for. Like Elias, it was both gentle and formidable. By mid-morning, Lily was playing quietly with a piece of string, weaving it into a cat's cradle, and Clara found herself tidying the cabin. She swept the floor, straightened the books, chopped carrots for a stew she planned to make with the potatoes she found in a sack. It wasn't her home, but the act of caring for it felt like a repayment, a way to balance the debt she felt to Elias. She watched Lily laugh, the sound soft but real, and realized there were no locks on the door, no shouting, no fear. For the first time in years, she felt the edges of belonging. When Elias returned, his cheeks red from the cold, he paused in the doorway, taking in the swept floor, the simmering pot. "You didn't have to do that," he said, but there was no reproach in his voice, only a quiet surprise. Clara met his gaze, her hands still damp from washing. "I wanted to," she said, and it was true. She saw the way his eyes softened, just for a moment, before he turned to hang his coat. He didn't ask about the bruises she hid, didn't press for her story, but she felt his awareness, like a weight he carried for her. As he sat at the table, sharing the stew she'd made, Clara watched him through the steam, her heart stirring with something she wasn't ready to name. For now, it was enough to be here, in this quiet cabin, where the world felt far away, and the scars on her neck remained her secret. The days in Elias Turner's cabin settled into a rhythm, fragile but steady, like the ticking of a clock in a quiet room. Clara woke each morning to the same scents, coffee brewing, wood smoke curling from the hearth, and the same sounds. Lily's soft breathing beside her in the narrow cot, the distant creak of Elias's boots as he tended to chores outside. The cabin, once foreign, began to feel like a refuge, its walls holding back the cold and the memories that clawed at her. Yet Clara's hand still drifted to her collar, ensuring the bruises remained hidden, a secret she guarded even as trust began to take root. Lily thrived in the stillness. Her cheeks grew pinker, her laughter brighter, as she followed Elias around the yard, trailing him like a shadow. He showed her how to feed the chickens, his large hands guiding her small ones to scatter grain, his voice patient as he named each hen, Matilda, Bess, Clover. Clara watched from the window, her heart caught between gratitude and unease. Lily's trust in Elias was uncomplicated, a child's faith, but Clara couldn't shake the fear that this safety was temporary, a dream that would shatter when her father's shadow found him. Elias, for his part, kept his distance, not physically, for the cabin was too small for that, but in the way he spoke, the way he moved. He asked no questions, demanded no truths, yet his presence filled the space. Clara noticed the small things, the way he left a clean towel by the wash basin each morning, the way he carved a wooden horse for Lily, its edges smoothed with care. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke of a kindness that felt both foreign and familiar, like a song she'd forgotten the words to. One afternoon, as the sun hung low, painting the snow golden, Clara found herself at the table, mending a tear in Lily's scarf. Elias sat across from her, sharpening a knife with a whetstone, the scrape of metal against stone a steady counterpoint to the fire's crackle. Lily played by the hearth, humming to her wooden horse, her small voice a thread weaving them together. Clara's needle paused, her eyes lifting to Elias. His hands moved with precision, but his gaze was distant, fixed on something beyond the cabin walls. "You're good with her," Clara said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a question she hadn't dared ask before. "Lily, she trusts you." Elias's hand stilled, the whetstone resting against the blade. He looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "She's a good kid," he said simply. "Reminds me of someone I used to know." He didn't elaborate, and Clara didn't press, but the words lingered, a glimpse into a past he kept as tightly guarded as her own. She returned to her sewing, the needle flashing in the firelight. "You don't have to do this," she said after a moment. "Take us in, I mean. Feed us. You don't know us." Elias set the knife down, his movements deliberate. "Don't need to know someone to see they're hurting," he said. His eyes flicked to her collar, just for a second, and Clara's breath caught. She adjusted the fabric, her fingers trembling, but he didn't linger on it. "I've got enough to share," he added, his voice steady, "and no one else to share it with." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken stories. Clara wanted to ask, who had he lost? What had carved that quiet sorrow into him? But she couldn't find the courage. Instead, she said, "Thank you." It was inadequate, but it was all she had. That evening, as they ate a simple meal of bread and stew, Clara felt a shift. The table, once a place of necessity, became a space of connection. Lily chattered about the chickens, her small hands animated, and Elias listened, his mouth twitching into something close to a smile. Clara watched them, her heart stirring with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something softer, something that made her want to stay. The next morning, Clara woke to find a pair of boots by the door, polished and set out as if waiting for her. They were hers, the ones she'd worn raw fleeing through the snow. But now they were clean, the leather softened with oil. She glanced at Elias, who was stirring the fire, his back to her. He didn't acknowledge the boots, didn't draw attention to the act, but Clara felt it like a touch. She slipped them on, the fit snug and warm, and stepped outside to join him. The air was crisp, the snow glittering under a pale sun. Elias was splitting wood again, his axe rising and falling with a rhythm that felt like the heartbeat of the cabin. Clara hesitated, then picked up a smaller axe from the pile, testing its weight. "Show me," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. Elias paused, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, she thought he might refuse, but then he nodded, stepping closer to adjust her grip. His hands were warm, calloused, and careful not to linger. "Keep your stance wide," he said. "Let the weight do the work." He stepped back, watching as she swung, the axe biting into the log with a satisfying thud. They worked in silence, the only sounds the crack of wood and their steady breaths. Clara felt the ache in her arms, the burn of effort, but it was a good ache, one that made her feel alive. When they finished, Elias carried the logs inside, and Clara followed, her cheeks flushed from the cold and something else, pride, perhaps, or the beginnings of trust. That night, as Lily slept and the fire burned low, Clara sat at the table, her hands idle for the first time in days. Elias was across from her, mending a harness, his fingers deft with the leather. The silence between them was comfortable now, less fraught with suspicion. Clara's eyes drifted to his hands, strong and scarred, and she wondered what it would feel like to have them hold hers, not in pity, but in something deeper. "You're healing," Elias said suddenly, his voice soft but clear. He didn't look up from his work, but Clara felt the words like a touch. She wanted to deny it, to say she was still broken, still running, but the truth was in the way her shoulders had softened, the way her heart no longer raced at every sound. She didn't answer, but her silence was enough. As the firelight danced across the cabin, Clara felt the scars on her neck, hidden beneath her collar, begin to fade, not in their marks, but in their power over her. Elias's presence, steady and unspoken, was a balm she hadn't expected. She didn't know what lay ahead, didn't know if she could stay, but for now, she let herself believe in the possibility of healing, of a life where fear didn't dictate every step. The Wyoming winter deepened, wrapping Elias Turner's cabin in a cocoon of snow and silence. Clara moved through the days with a cautious ease, her hands finding purpose in small tasks, kneading dough, mending torn linens, teaching Lily to read from the worn Bible on Elias's shelf. The cabin, once a stranger's domain, had become a haven, its walls holding warmth and something more, the fragile threads of a life she hadn't dared imagine. Yet beneath her growing comfort, a shadow lingered. Each creak of the floorboards, each gust of wind against the shutters, sent her heart racing, her fingers brushing the high collar that hid her scars. Lily, oblivious to Clara's fears, blossomed in the cabin's quiet embrace. She trailed Elias everywhere, her chatter filling the air as she helped him carry firewood or sweep the porch. Elias indulged her with a patience that surprised Clara, carving her another wooden toy, a tiny bird with wings that moved, and listening to her stories with a seriousness that made her beam. Clara watched these moments from the doorway or the window, her heart caught between gratitude and a growing ache she couldn't name. Elias was a steady presence, his kindness unwavering, yet he never crossed the invisible line Clara had drawn. He didn't ask about her past, didn't pry into the reasons she flinched at sudden sounds, but his eyes, dark and knowing, seemed to see more than she wanted. One evening, as the sky burned orange beyond the pines, Clara sat by the fire, darning a sock, while Lily slept curled on the cot. Elias was at the table, his hands busy with a piece of iron he was shaping into a hinge, the soft scrape of his file a counterpoint to the fire's crackle. The air was thick with unspoken words, and Clara felt them pressing against her, urging her to speak. She set the needle down, her fingers trembling. "Why do you do this?" she asked, her voice low but clear. "Help us, I mean. You don't owe us anything." Elias's hands paused, the file hovering over the iron. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set the file down, leaning back in his chair. "I had a sister once," he said, his voice rough, like it hadn't been used for such truths in a long time. "Younger, like your Lily. She got sick after the war, and I couldn't." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "I couldn't save her. When I saw you on that platform, you looked like you were carrying the same kind of weight. I couldn't walk away." Clara's breath caught, the weight of his words settling over her. She wanted to ask more, about his sister, about the war that had left its mark on him, but the pain in his eyes stopped her. Instead, she said, "I'm sorry." The words felt small, but they were all she had. Elias nodded, his gaze dropping to the hinge. "We all carry something," he said. "Doesn't mean we have to carry it alone." The words lingered, heavy with meaning, and Clara felt a pull toward him, a longing to share her own burdens. She thought of her father's hands, the man with the crooked nose, the nights she'd spent hiding with Lily in barns and ditches. But the words stuck in her throat, held back by fear, not of Elias, but of what speaking might unleash. She adjusted her collar, her fingers brushing the fading bruises, and returned to her darning. The silence between them softer now, almost intimate. The next morning, Clara woke to find a small package wrapped in cloth by her bedside. Inside was a shawl, soft and gray, its edges neatly hemmed. It wasn't new, but it was clean, and it smelled faintly of cedar, like the spare room where she and Lily slept. She looked for Elias, but he was already outside, hammering at his forge, the clang of metal echoing through the yard. She draped the shawl over her shoulders, its warmth a quiet gift, and stepped outside to join him. The forge was a low shed, its walls blackened with soot, the air thick with the scent of charcoal and iron. Elias worked with his back to her, his shirt clinging to his shoulders as he shaped a horseshoe. Clara watched, mesmerized by the rhythm of his movements, the way the firelight danced across his face. "Thank you," she said, touching the shawl. "For this." He glanced at her, his eyes softening. "It was my mother's," he said. "Thought it might suit you." He turned back to the forge, but not before Clara caught the faintest flush on his cheeks. She stayed, watching him work, the heat of the forge warming her face. "Can I help?" she asked, surprising herself. Elias raised an eyebrow, then handed her a pair of tongs, showing her how to hold the hot iron steady. Their hands brushed once, briefly, and Clara felt a spark that had nothing to do with the forge. She focused on the task, her movements clumsy at first, but growing steadier under his guidance. They worked in silence, the clang of the hammer a shared language, and for the first time, Clara felt like she belonged, not just in the cabin, but beside him. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Lily asleep and the wind howling outside, Clara felt the weight of her secrets pressing harder. Elias was whittling, his knife shaping a piece of wood into something she couldn't yet discern. The firelight caught the planes of his face, and she realized she was studying him. The way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way his hands, so strong, moved with such care. Her heart stirred, a mix of fear and longing, and she knew she was falling for him, despite herself. "I ran for my father," she said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Elias's knife paused, but he didn't look up, giving her space to continue. "He hurt me, wanted to sell me to a man I didn't know. I took Lily and ran." Her voice broke, and she touched her collar, her fingers trembling. "I don't know if he's still looking." Elias set the knife down, his eyes meeting hers. There was no pity in his gaze, only a quiet fury, tempered by something softer. "He won't find you here," he said, his voice low and certain. "Not while I'm breathing." Clara's eyes burned, and she looked away, the shawl warm against her shoulders. She didn't know if she could believe him, didn't know if safety could last, but in that moment, she wanted to. The fire crackled, and the cabin held them close, a fragile sanctuary against the storm outside. The snow fell softly now, no longer driven by the fierce winds that had marked Clara's arrival in Bitter Creek. Inside Elias Turner's cabin, the world felt small and safe, the fire's glow casting long shadows across the walls. Clara moved through the days with a quiet purpose, her hands busy with chores, her heart grappling with the confession she'd made to Elias. The words she'd spoken about her father, about the man with the crooked nose, had left her raw, exposed, yet lighter, as if she'd shed a weight she hadn't known she carried. Elias hadn't pressed for more, hadn't filled the silence with promises or pity, but his presence had shifted, steadier, fiercer, like a shield between her and the past. Lily, unaware of the truths shared in the firelight, continued to weave herself into the fabric of the cabin. She'd taken to drawing with a piece of charcoal on scraps of paper Elias brought from town, her sketches of chickens and horses pinned to the walls. Clara watched her sister's joy with a mix of awe and fear, knowing how fragile this happiness was. Each night, as she tucked Lily into the cot, she whispered prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood, asking for strength, for safety, for a future she could barely imagine. Elias, too, seemed changed. He lingered longer at the table after meals, his dark eyes meeting Clara's with a warmth that made her breath catch. He taught her more about the forge, showing her how to temper iron, his hands guiding hers with a care that felt like a promise. Clara felt the pull between them growing, a current she both craved and feared. She'd never known love, not the kind that didn't demand something in return, and the thought of it, of Elias, made her heart race with hope and terror. One morning, as the sun broke through the clouds, Elias returned from town with a bundle under his arm. He set it on the table, his expression unreadable. "For you," he said, nodding to Clara. She hesitated, her fingers brushing the coarse fabric before unwrapping it. Inside was a dress, simple blue, with a high collar and buttons down the front. It was new, the fabric soft but sturdy, and Clara's throat tightened at the sight of it. She looked at Elias, searching his face for expectation, for a debt she'd have to repay, but found only quiet sincerity. "It's for teaching," he said, his voice low. "Heard the schoolmarm left town. They're looking for someone to take her place. Thought you might." He trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck. "If you want." Clara's hands trembled as she touched the dress. Teaching. The word stirred memories of her mother, who taught her to read by candlelight, her voice soft and steady. It was a dream Clara had buried long ago, beneath her father's fists and the weight of survival. "I don't know if I can," she whispered, her eyes burning. Elias stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that she felt his warmth. "You can," he said. "You're stronger than you know." His words were a lifeline, and Clara clung to them, her heart pounding with the possibility of a new beginning. That afternoon, she tried on the dress, the fabric cool against her skin. She stood before the small mirror in the spare room, her fingers tracing the collar that hid her scars. The bruises had faded, but the marks remained, a reminder of what she'd survived. She met her own gaze in the glass, seeing not just the fear but the resilience, the woman who'd carried Lily through snow and darkness. She straightened her shoulders, and for the first time, she felt like she could be more than a fugitive. The next day, Clara walked to the schoolhouse with Lily, the blue dress swaying against her ankles. Elias had offered to drive them, but she'd wanted to walk, to feel the ground beneath her feet as she claimed this new path. The school was small, its walls weathered, but the children's voices spilling from the open door were bright and eager. Clara taught them letters and numbers, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest, and by the end of the day, she felt a spark of purpose she hadn't known she'd lost. When she returned to the cabin, Elias was waiting, his hammer resting on his shoulder as he stood by the forge. He didn't ask how it went, but his eyes searched hers, and Clara smiled, a small, genuine smile that felt like a gift. "They listened," she said, and he nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Lily asleep and the cabin quiet, Clara felt the weight of her scars lessen. She looked at Elias, his hands idle for once, and the words she'd held back spilled out. "I want to stay," she said, her voice trembling but sure. "Here, with you." Elias's eyes widened, and for a moment he was still, as if her words had struck him like a hammer to iron. Then he leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "Clara," he said, her name soft on his lips. "I've wanted that since I saw you on that platform. But I need you to know, I'll never ask more than you're ready to give. And if anyone comes for you, they'll have to go through me." Clara's heart swelled, the fear that had bound her loosening its grip. She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing his calloused palm, and he held hers gently, as if she were something precious. The touch was electric, grounding, and Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not of sorrow, but of hope. Days later, word came from town. A stranger had been asking questions, a man with a crooked nose and a wad of cash. Clara's blood ran cold, but Elias's jaw set, his hammer in hand as he promised to keep watch. That night, as she lay beside Lily, Clara knew the past might find her, but she was no longer alone. Elias's vow echoed in her heart, and the cabin's walls held her close. In the weeks that followed, Clara taught at the school, her voice growing stronger, her scars fading into memory. Elias worked at his forge, his hammer shaping iron and a future she dared to believe in. Lily's laughter filled the cabin, and Clara's love for Elias deepened, a quiet flame that warmed her through the winter. The stranger never came, perhaps deterred by Elias's quiet strength or the town's loyalty to their blacksmith. Clara didn't know, but she chose to trust the life she was building, one day at a time. As spring approached, the snow melted, revealing green beneath. Clara stood on the porch, the blue dress soft against her skin, Elias's shawl around her shoulders. He joined her, his hand finding hers, and they watched Lily chase the chickens, her laughter bright as the sun. Clara leaned against him, her scars no longer a secret but a testament to her survival. In that moment, she knew she found her home, not just in the cabin, but in the love that had healed her, steady and true as the man beside her.